He used his wife and daughter as a shield. Then he confessed to execution. May 7th, 2017. A Sunday afternoon in Bellaire, Ohio. The kind of spring day where the air is warm enough to leave the windows open. David Kinney, a 30-year-old coal miner, loaded his wife and his 13-year-old stepdaughter into the family truck. He told them they were running a quick errand. They were going to return a weed trimmer to his best friend, Brad McGarry. It was a simple favor, a mundane task between two men who had spent years sharing holidays, vacations, and the kind of bond that made Brad an honorary uncle to David's children. The family pulled up to Brad's house on Wagoner Avenue in West Bellaire. They knocked on the front door. No answer. They walked around to the back and found the service door slightly ajar. A strange feeling must have settled over them. David entered the house while his wife and daughter waited. What he found in the basement would change everything. He emerged moments later, screaming for his wife to call 911. His body was shaking. He was crying so hard he could barely breathe. On the body cam footage, you can hear him saying, "I'm trying not to freak out. I'm sorry. I can't stop seeing that. I'm not supposed to see that man." He sounded like a man shattered by grief. He looked like a man who had just discovered his best friend's body. But the police who arrived on the scene that day would soon realize that David Kinney was not a grieving friend. He was a man who had just used his wife and his 13-year-old daughter as human shields to cover up an execution. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. David Kinney was a young husband and father who had built his entire identity around being a family man. He had met his wife when he was just 21, and he fell for her hard. She was a single mother with 3 children, and there were people in his life who told him he was too young to take on that kind of responsibility. But David didn't care. He loved her, and he loved those kids as if they were his own. He took a dangerous job in the coal mines to provide for them. He was the kind of man who showed up, who paid the bills, who played the role of the devoted husband and father without complaint. He worked underground in the dark, in the dust, in the heat, because that's what it took to keep his family fed and clothed. By all appearances, David Kinney was the picture of a hardworking American man who had sacrificed his own comfort for the people he loved. And then there was Brad McGarry. Brad was 43 years old, a coal mine foreman who had once been a hairdresser. He was openly gay in a small Appalachian town where that took real courage. He had a larger-than-life personality, an infectious laugh, and a house full of country-style art and antiques that he loved to collect. He was a man who refused to hide who he was, even when it would have been easier to do so. He and David had met years earlier during a coal mining training class and had become inseparable. They worked together, they laughed together, and David's family had welcomed Brad into their lives completely. The kids called him Uncle Brad. They went on vacations together. They planned trips together. They were the kind of friends that people envy. But behind the closed doors of that friendship, something else was happening. Something that David had been hiding from everyone, especially from his wife. David Kinney and Brad McGarry were not just friends. They were lovers. They had been carrying on a secret affair for years. Brad's cousin later told investigators that Brad had been seeing a married man named DJ and that the relationship had been going on for years. When police pressed her for more information, she told them that DJ was David Kinney. She said that Brad had told her the two of them were having problems because Brad wanted DJ to leave his wife. David was terrified. He had built his entire life around being a husband and a father. He had convinced himself that if his wife ever found out the truth about his sexuality and his affair, everything he had worked for would collapse. So when Brad started pressuring him to come out, to leave his wife, to stop living a lie, David saw his perfect life slipping away. And he made a decision that would destroy everyone involved. On the afternoon of May 7th, 2017, David drove to Brad's house. He arrived in his wife's car, not his own, perhaps hopping to avoid being recognized by neighbors. The neighbor's surveillance camera captured him pulling up to Brad's house around the time of the murder. He stayed for about 40 minutes. What happened inside that house during those 40 minutes, only David truly knows. But the evidence tells a clear story. Brad McGarry was shot twice. Both bullets entered the back of his head. He was on his knees when the first shot was fired. The second shot came moments later. This was not a struggle. This was not a fight. This was an execution. David would later claim that Brad had pulled a gun on him, that the two had struggled, and that he had fired in self-defense. But the forensics told a different story. You cannot shoot a man twice in the back of his head while he is on his knees and call it self-defense. The laws of physics simply do not allow it. After the shooting, David staged the crime scene. He ransacked the kitchen. He threw drawers open. He made a mess of the living room. He wanted it to look like a robbery gone wrong. But he made a critical mistake. He left behind Brad's valuable art collection. He left behind cash. He left behind a television. Nothing was stolen. The lead detective on the case would later say that it was the most staged crime scene he had ever seen in his life. Then David went home. He waited. He gathered his wife and his 13-year-old stepdaughter. He told them they needed to return a weed trimmer to Brad's house, and he drove them straight to the scene of the murder he had just committed. When the family arrived at Brad's house, David played his role perfectly. He knocked. He looked confused when no one answered. He led his wife and daughter around to the back. He entered the house and discovered the body. He screamed. He cried. He told his wife to call 911. On that 911 call, you can hear the panic in her voice, the terror of a woman who believes her husband has just stumbled upon a nightmare. But what she didn't know was that her husband had already lived that nightmare. He had created it. He had pulled the trigger. And then he had brought her and their daughter to the scene so that they could serve as his alibi. He used them as shields. He knew that no one would suspect a man who arrived at a crime scene with his wife and child. He knew that his tears would look genuine because, in some twisted way, they probably were. He had just killed his best friend, the man he had loved in secret for years. And now he was standing outside that house, crying, telling the police he couldn't stop seeing the image of Brad's body. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, but the performance was about to fall apart. The police began their investigation. They interviewed friends and family. They looked for enemies. They considered the possibility of a hate crime because Brad was an openly gay man in a conservative town. But everyone they spoke to described Brad as beloved, a man with no enemies. Then they interviewed Brad's cousin, who told them about DJ. She told them that DJ was a married man, that Brad had been having an affair with him for years, and that DJ's name was David Kinney. The lead detective later said that when he found out DJ was David, everything stopped making sense. Up until that point, David had been nothing but a witness, a grieving friend who had discovered the body. But now, he was the prime suspect. The police brought David in for questioning. He changed his story 7 or 8 times. First, he said he had just gone to return the weed trimmer. Then he admitted he had been at the house earlier, but said an unknown man had shown up and shot Brad. Then he claimed self-defense, saying Brad had pulled a gun on him. Each version contradicted the last. Each version was a desperate attempt to escape the truth. But the evidence was overwhelming. The neighbor's surveillance footage placed him at the scene. The phone records placed him at the scene. The forensics showed that Brad had been executed, not killed in a struggle, and the staged crime scene screamed of a cover-up. On May 9, 2017, David Kinney was arrested and charged with Brad's murder. But perhaps the most devastating moment of this entire case came after the arrest. The police allowed David to speak with his wife one last time before they took him to jail. The conversation was captured, and it is heartbreaking to listen to. David confessed to his wife that he had been having an affair with Brad. He told her that he had killed Brad. He tried to explain it away as self-defense. His wife sat there, stunned, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. This was the man she had loved for years, the man who had raised her children, the man who had taken her to that house, to that crime scene, and let her discover the body of a man he had just murdered. She asked him through tears if he was mocking her. She told him she couldn't even bear to look at him. In that moment, the weight of David's betrayal crashed down on her. He had not only killed his best friend, he had used her. He had used her daughter. He had taken them to that house and made them part of his alibi. He had made them witnesses to his crime without their knowledge. He had shattered their trust, their sense of safety, and their entire understanding of who he was. David Kinney went to trial in January 2018. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence: the neighbor's surveillance footage, the phone records, the forensic analysis of the crime scene, the autopsy results showing 2 gunshot wounds to the back of the head. They called Brad's cousin to the stand, who testified about the affair. They played the 911 call. They showed the body cam footage of David crying outside the house. The defense argued that David had acted in self-defense, that Brad had pulled a gun on him, and that the shooting had been a tragic accident. But the evidence was too strong. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a verdict. They found David Kinney guilty of aggravated murder with a firearm specification. The judge, Frank Fregiato, had a difficult decision to make. The law required a life sentence, but the judge had the power to decide whether David would ever be eligible for parole. The prosecution asked for life without parole. The defense asked for a chance at parole, arguing that David had been a law-abiding citizen before this tragedy. The judge listened to both sides, and then he made his decision. Before the sentence was handed down, David was given the opportunity to speak. He stood before the court and apologized to Brad's family. "I would like to apologize to the McGarry family for all the hurt and pain I put you through," he said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, and I wish I could take it all back. All the apologies in the world will never bring him back, but I want you to know I truly am sorry for it all." But the judge was not moved. He looked at David and said something that cut to the heart of the matter. The jury unanimously found him guilty of aggravated murder, a premeditated execution-style murder, shooting his supposed friend in the back of the head twice. "Only Mr. Kinney knows why," the prosecutor had argued. And then the judge added his own words. "If this man was able to do an assassin's job to someone he loved and was his best friend, what could he do to his enemy or someone who opposed him?" The judge sentenced David Kinney to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 3 years for the firearm specification. David would never walk free again. He would never see his wife again. He would never watch his children grow up. He would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, paying for the moment he chose to silence the man he loved rather than face the truth about who he was. Brad McGarry's friends and family were left to pick up the pieces. They had lost a man who was larger than life, a man who had refused to hide who he was even in a town that wasn't always welcoming. They had lost an uncle, a friend, a foreman, a man with an infectious laugh, and a personality that filled every room he entered. And they had lost him to someone he trusted, someone he loved, someone who had pretended to be his best friend while secretly planning his murder. The case was a tragedy on every level. It was a tragedy of fear and denial. It was a tragedy of a man who was so terrified of his secret being exposed that he chose to kill rather than come clean. It was a tragedy of a wife and children who were used as pawns in a cover-up. And it was a tragedy of a community that had to confront the fact that one of their own, a man they had trusted, a man they had seen as a devoted husband and father, was capable of such cold-blooded violence. David Kinney's appeals have been denied. As of today, he remains incarcerated in Ohio, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Brad McGarry is gone. The coal mines of Bellaire continue to operate, but 2 men who once worked side by side will never return to them. One is dead, and the other is in prison for the rest of his life. All because a man was too afraid to tell the truth. All because a man chose to destroy everyone around him rather than admit who he really was.